The warning. The late afternoon sun slid across the glass walls of Langston Global Tower, painting the streets below in strips of gold and shadow. Employees hurried out with briefcases and tired eyes, eager to escape another demanding day. The lobby echoed with polished shoes, clipped voices, and the steady rhythm of business life. Outside, a sleek black sedan gleamed at the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the towering building. It was waiting for one woman, Clara Langston, CEO, billionaire, and the kind of leader who ruled boardrooms with sharp intelligence and unshakable control. She was a woman feared by rivals and admired by her staff, a perfectionist who demanded results from everyone around her. But there was one man in the crowd who wasn't rushing home. Darius Cole, dressed in gray janitor's coveralls that bore faint bleach stains and the smell of cleaning solution, stood near the service entrance. His shift had stretched longer than expected, and exhaustion tugged at his body, but his eyes were sharp and alert. Darius was a man who noticed things others ignored: the way doors closed too quickly, the faint hum of machines, the smallest flicker of something out of place. It was a habit born from years of survival, from raising his daughter Amara alone after tragedy, from knowing the world didn't always give second chances. That was why, when he saw Clara Langston stride toward the waiting car, something inside him screamed. It wasn't the ordinary fear of power or the distance between their worlds. It was instinct, raw and undeniable. He caught the subtle vibration under the pavement, the shimmer near the vehicle's wheel well, and the way the driver avoided eye contact. His chest tightened. Something was wrong. Something dangerous. The CEO's heels clicked with authority against the marble steps as she descended, her assistant trailing 2 steps behind with a tablet clutched to her chest. Security flanked her, tall men in black suits, scanning the area with practiced eyes. Yet none of them noticed what Darius saw. He felt his pulse hammering in his ears, and before he could stop himself, the words ripped out of him like a warning siren. "Ma'am, don't get in the car." The shout cut through the crisp evening air like a blade. Heads turned, phones paused mid-scroll. The 2 security guards stiffened instantly, one moving toward Clara, the other toward Darius. Clara herself froze with her hand on the chrome handle of the sedan, her brow tightening in annoyance at the interruption. She turned slightly, and her gaze fell on him. The janitor, dark-skinned, sweaty from his long shift, clutching his keyring like a lifeline. For 1 tense second the world seemed suspended. Then everything snapped back into motion. The guards lunged toward Darius, gripping his arms and forcing him back. His keys clattered to the ground and he gasped as they twisted his wrist. "Back away from the CEO," one barked, his tone sharp with authority. Clara's driver opened the rear door, ready for her to step inside, but she hesitated. The echo of Darius's words still lingered. "I'm telling you, don't let her in that car." Darius struggled against the hold, desperation cracking his voice. His eyes darted to Clara, pleading, "Please, ma'am, just don't." Clara narrowed her eyes, her mind caught between irritation and unease. In her world, fear came dressed in spreadsheets and financial audits, not in the warnings of a janitor on the sidewalk. Yet there was something in his tone, not madness, not arrogance, but urgency so sharp it cut through her pride. For a woman who lived by precision, she recognized when something was too exact to be random. She stepped back from the car door, her heels clicking softly as she created distance. "Explain," she demanded. Her voice was low, clipped, the kind that commanded entire rooms into silence. The guards hesitated, still gripping Darius. He was breathing hard, sweat rolling down his temple, but his gaze never wavered from her. "It's not safe," he rasped. "The car. Something's wrong. Look under the wheel well. There's wiring. I saw it when I passed earlier. Please." One of the guards snorted. "He's lying, probably trying to—" "Check it," Clara interrupted sharply. Her instincts whispered caution, and she never ignored her instincts. "Now." Within seconds a search began. Another guard crouched by the vehicle, running a practiced hand along the edges. His movements slowed. His eyes widened slightly. He muttered into his radio, and in less than a minute, the entire entrance was swarmed. Sirens blared in the distance as police vehicles closed in. Yellow tape cordoned off the area. The sedan was isolated, its driver ordered out at gunpoint, trembling as he raised his hands. Clara watched it all unfold with a mixture of fury and icy composure. She glanced at Darius, still restrained, his jaw tight but his eyes steady. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't relieved. He was simply waiting, as though all of this only confirmed what he already knew. The bomb squad arrived, methodical and precise. They sent a robot toward the sedan, cameras whirring. Every employee left in the building pressed against the windows, whispering nervously. 30 minutes passed, then 45. Finally, the announcement came. The vehicle was rigged with an explosive device hidden within its chassis. It hadn't been armed yet, but it was there, real and deadly. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some gasped, others muttered disbelief. Clara's expression didn't change, but deep inside, something cold settled in her chest. If she had entered that car without hesitation, if she had dismissed the janitor's cry, her life could have ended before sunset. And yet instead of gratitude, her first reaction was anger. Anger at the chaos, at the breach of security, at the fact that a man in stained coveralls had seen what her trained staff had not. Her entire company's image now teetered on the edge of scandal, and all because of one desperate shout. "Release him," Clara ordered, her tone icy. The guards loosened their grip, and Darius staggered to his feet, rubbing his wrists. He looked up at her, wary but unbroken. Clara stepped closer, her eyes sharp as steel. "You just disrupted the operations of an entire corporation. You cost me a critical meeting and risked my reputation. If you don't want me to ruin the rest of your life, you have 5 seconds to tell me how you knew." Darius swallowed hard, his heart pounding. He thought of Amara, waiting for him at home, curled on the couch with her sketchbook, her small hands trembling from the illness that was slowly stealing her childhood. He couldn't risk being labeled crazy. He couldn't risk losing the only income keeping her fed and sheltered. But the truth pressed against his lips, and finally he whispered just enough to shake the unshakable CEO before him. "Neurosynaptic decay syndrome," he said, his voice breaking. Clara froze. The name of that rare, devastating illness was one she had buried behind walls of silence. Her own mother had suffered from it, a fact known to no one beyond the closest circle of family and doctors. The fact that this janitor knew it, spoke it out loud on a public street, was impossible. Unless he wasn't lying, unless there was more. Her eyes flickered with the first hint of doubt. Then, after a long silence, she gave a single decisive order. "Bring him upstairs." The crowd parted as Darius was escorted into the glass tower, not as a janitor, not as a suspect, but as the man who had shouted loud enough to change everything. Doubt and disbelief. The boardroom on the 50th floor of Langston Global Tower was nothing like the world Darius Cole knew. It was a place of polished obsidian tables, walls made of glass, and a ceiling that looked out over the entire city. From here, Clara Langston made decisions that shifted markets, crushed competitors, and built empires. It was her throne room, her battlefield, and her sanctuary of control. And now, into that space, she had brought a man who didn't belong, a janitor with calloused hands and bleach-stained coveralls, still carrying the weight of his warning. Darius sat at the far end of the long table, his body stiff, his eyes darting between the guards who lined the walls. He had never been this high up in the tower before. Usually, his duties ended in the sublevels, scrubbing locker rooms, emptying waste bins, and polishing floors that executives never stepped on. Up here, everything gleamed as if it had never known dirt. He felt like a trespasser, but also like a man on trial. Clara stood across from him, arms crossed, her expression carved from stone. Her assistant hovered nearby, silent, her tablet glowing with notes and background checks already underway. Clara's voice was calm, measured, but every syllable carried a sharp edge. "You had no clearance to interfere with my security," she began, pacing slowly. "You caused a disruption that cost me a critical meeting, a deal that has been in negotiation for months. You have no authority, no training, and no credibility in this matter. Yet you knew something even my own team did not. So, Mr. Cole, I'll ask you again. How? Darius took a slow breath, forcing his nerves under control. His hands itched to reach for his phone, to check if Amara had eaten her dinner or if she had called the neighbor when the tremors in her hands grew worse. But here, he had no such comfort. He had only the truth, and even that felt fry. Agile. I clean these halls every day, he said, his voice steady though his throat was dry. I see things most people overlook. A piece of paper that doesn't belong in the shred bin, a wire sticking out from under a wheel well. I notice patterns. When something breaks, I'm the one who fixes it. Tonight I saw something I couldn't ignore. Clara narrowed her eyes. You expect me to believe you simply noticed? Yes, he said firmly. That's my job. Not just mopping floors, but seeing the details. Details matter. And tonight, those details would have killed you. The room fell silent. Even the guards shifted slightly, glancing at one another. Darius's words didn't carry the polish of an executive speech, but they carried something rarer, conviction. Clara studied him, weighing every twitch of his face. She had built her empire by detecting lies, by cutting through excuses to the raw truth beneath. And in this man's eyes, she saw no calculation, only exhaustion, only a father's fear. But she wasn't ready to let him walk free. And what of this term you used? Neurosynaptic decay syndrome. She spoke the words slowly, as if tasting them. That is not something a janitor should know. Darius's chest tightened. He glanced at the guards, at the assistant, then back at Clara. His voice lowered, almost to a whisper. My daughter, Amara. She was diagnosed 6 months ago. She's only 7. I spend every spare hour reading medical journals, digging through scraps of information, praying for something the doctors haven't found yet. That's how I recognized it. For the first time, Clara's mask slipped, only slightly, but enough. A flicker in her eyes. She knew the pain of that illness, its merciless progression, the hopelessness it planted in families. Her own mother had suffered, and the memory was buried deep in her. She inhaled sharply, then turned her gaze away before interrogating. No one else could see her reaction. Her assistant broke the silence, her voice careful. Ma'am, we've pulled his records. Everything matches. Employment history, address, medical documents for his daughter. It's consistent. Clara cut her off with a raised hand. That will be all. The assistant hesitated, then left the room, leaving Clara and Darius alone with the guards. The CEO circled the table slowly, her heels echoing against the polished floor. She stopped directly behind Darius, her voice dropping so only he could hear. Do you know what kind of power you played with today? One false word from me and your life is over. No job, no future, no treatment for your daughter. You'd be a ghost in this city. Darius clenched his jaw. Then why didn't you do it already? The question hung in the air, bold and reckless. Clara's lips tightened. The truth was, she didn't know. Something about him unsettled her, not because of what he'd said, but because of the precision of it. He hadn't been guessing. He hadn't been seeking attention. He had spoken with the kind of certainty that couldn't be faked. Before she could respond, the boardroom door opened, and Marcus Graves, head of security, stepped in. His voice was clipped, his expression grim. Ma'am, you were right to hesitate. The sedan was rigged. Our sweep confirmed it. Timed device, crude but effective. Whoever planted it wanted you dead. The guard straightened. Darius closed his eyes briefly, relief and dread colliding in his chest. Clara remained perfectly still. She had expected confirmation, yet hearing it aloud brought a sharp clarity. She turned slowly toward Graves. Find out how a janitor saw this before you did. Her words were cold, but the edge of doubt in her voice was directed inward. She prided herself on control, on surrounding herself with the best, and yet the man who had saved her life was the one most invisible in her tower. The meeting ended with no resolution. Clara ordered Darius held under watch until further notice. She didn't trust him, but she couldn't dismiss him either. He was both a liability and a puzzle, and she wasn't about to let puzzles walk out the door unsolved. That night, as the city lights spread like constellations across the skyline, Darius sat alone in a quiet office, staring at his hands. He thought of Amara's smile when he told her bedtime stories, her small fingers gripping a pencil as she drew castles with gates strong enough to keep monsters out. He wondered if she was asleep yet, if she had asked the neighbor when he would be home. His chest ached with the weight of absence. Across the tower, Clara sat in her private office, staring at a file on her screen, the medical records of Amara Cole. Tremors, loss of motor control, terminal prognosis. The words cut like shards of glass, stirring memories she had tried to bury. She closed the file, leaned back in her chair and whispered into the empty room. Why you, of all people? For the first time in years, Clara Langston felt something foreign, doubt. And for Darius Cole, the janitor who had shouted into the wind, doubt was the only chance he had left. The hidden truth. The next morning dawned gray, the city smothered under low clouds that blurred the skyline. In the penthouse office of Langston Tower, Clara Langston sat with her elbows braced on her desk, the glow of her tablet casting faint light across her face. She had not slept. Instead, she had spent the night combing through reports, records, and surveillance feeds. The weight of what had happened, what almost happened, had settled heavily on her chest. For the first time in years, she felt the edges of her control slipping. The car bomb was no coincidence. It was a direct attack, precise and deliberate. And the fact that Darius Cole, a janitor, had spotted it before her own seasoned security team haunted her thoughts. She wanted to dismiss him, to believe it was luck or madness, yet she couldn't erase the image of his eyes, burning with certainty, unflinching even as guards dragged him to the ground. That was not the look of a liar. Clara opened another file, this one on Darius himself. His employee profile was thin, the kind HR overlooked. 10 years of steady service, no complaints, no promotions, no remarkable notes. But as she dug deeper into external records, a different picture emerged. Darius Cole had once been an engineering student at a prestigious university. He had earned top marks, published promising research in mechanical diagnostics, and been on track for a future that might have led him into the very corporate world that now ignored him. But 10 years ago, everything stopped. His wife died in a sudden accident. His daughter, only an infant then, was left in his care. With no family to lean on, no money, and a grief too heavy to carry, he dropped out. He took whatever work he could find, eventually settling as a janitor in Langston Tower because it offered stability, health insurance, and a night shift that allowed him to be home with Amara during the day. Clara leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled beneath her chin. This was no ordinary janitor. This was a man with an untapped mind, someone who had traded ambition for survival. She felt an uncomfortable pang, a recognition of sacrifice she herself had never been forced to make. Meanwhile, in the holding office 2 floors below, Darius sat with his head bowed, exhaustion heavy in his bones. He had been awake all night too, but for different reasons. His thoughts circled Amara like a restless hawk. He imagined her walking up to an empty apartment, her small voice asking the neighbor where her daddy was. Every hour away from her felt like a betrayal. Yet he also knew that walking out of this building wasn't an option, not anymore. He had seen too much, and Clara Langston was not the kind of woman to leave loose ends. The door opened, and Marcus Graves stepped inside, carrying a thin folder. His presence filled the room like a wall. He dropped the folder on the table and leaned against the glass wall, arms folded. "You've caused quite a stir, Cole. The CEO doesn't like mysteries, and you're a walking one." Darius lifted his gaze. "I didn't ask to be here." "No," Graves said evenly. "But here you are, so help yourself. Tell me how you knew about that car." Darius hesitated. He thought of the shredded papers he had pieced together in the trash bins of the 24th floor, the confidential fragments he had taped back in his tiny apartment late at night. He thought of the numbers, the formulas, the coded references to neurological research buried under corporate budgets. He had recognized terms connected to Amara's illness, hints of something more than just financial reports. But how could he explain that without sounding like a conspiracy theorist? "I just noticed," he muttered finally. Graves studied him in silence. His eyes were sharp, trained to pierce through deception. But after a long pause, he simply closed the folder and left, leaving Darius alone again. Upstairs, Clara convened an emergency meeting with a handful of trusted executives. They sat around the long black table, their suits crisp, their voices tense. Reports of the attempted attack had already leaked to the press, though details were scarce. The story was being contained, but the questions remained. Who had targeted her? Why now? And how had a janitor seen what no one else had? One of the executives, a gray-haired man named Sterling, leaned forward. "Ma'am, with respect, you're giving too much weight to this custodian. It was chance, coincidence, nothing more." Clara's gaze cut to him like a blade. "Coincidence doesn't wire explosives into my car. Coincidence doesn't speak the name of a disease that should be buried in my private history. No, Sterling, this was not chance." The room fell silent. None of them dared to push further. After the meeting, Clara returned to her office and stared out at the rain streaking the glass. Her mind replayed fragments of memory, her mother's trembling hands, her own helplessness as the disease consumed her. The world had not known, and she had made sure of it. Yet somehow, this janitor had spoken the name aloud, cutting through years of silence. She needed answers, and she would get them. Late that evening, Clara descended to the office where Darius waited. She entered alone this time, the guards stationed outside. Darius stood when she entered, weary but still proud. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You were once an engineer," she said flatly, "top of your class. You could have built a career, but you didn't. Why?" Darius's throat tightened. He looked away, his voice low. "My wife died. I had a baby girl to raise. School didn't matter anymore. She did." Clara's expression softened imperceptibly, though her tone remained firm. "And now you mop floors to pay for her treatment." He met her gaze then, unflinching. "I'd mop floors until my hands bled if it kept her alive." The words struck Clara with a weight she hadn't expected. For a moment she saw not a janitor, but a man carrying a burden heavier than any corporate empire. She saw the quiet kind of strength that never made headlines, but kept the world turning. "Tell me what you found," she said finally. "No half-truths, no excuses, everything." Darius hesitated, then drew a shaky breath. "A month ago, I found shredded papers in the lab's disposal bin, numbers, diagrams, medical terms I recognized from my research into Amara's illness. I pieced them together. It wasn't about a cure, it was about trials, dangerous ones, using resources from this company. Someone here is hiding it, and if you look deep enough, you'll see I'm right." Clara's pulse quickened, though her face remained composed. If what he said was true, then corruption ran deeper than she had imagined. It wasn't just about her life being targeted. It was about her company being twisted into something she didn't recognize. "You realize what you're suggesting," she said coldly. "If you're lying, you'll lose everything. If you're telling the truth, you may have just put yourself and your daughter in greater danger than you know." Darius's eyes burned with quiet fire. "I've been in danger every day since the doctors told me there was no cure for my little girl. I've got nothing left to lose." Clara studied him in silence. The storm outside rumbled, lightning streaking across the skyline. At last she gave a single nod. "Very well, Mr. Cole. We'll test your theory. And if you're right, then both of us have enemies we cannot afford to ignore." For the first time, Darius saw something shift in Clara Langston's eyes. Not suspicion, not contempt, but the faint spark of reluctant respect. And somewhere in the shadows of Langston Global, the people who had planted that device realized their plan had failed. The janitor had seen too much. The CEO was asking questions. The game was changing. The hidden truth was beginning to surface, and it would shake the company to its core. The breakthrough. The storm that had rolled in the night before lingered into morning, leaving the city slick and gray, with clouds pressing low against the skyline. Inside Langston Tower, the air was just as heavy, though for very different reasons. Clara Langston walked briskly through the executive floor, her heels tapping against the marble as she moved with the precision of a woman who tolerated neither wasted time nor wasted words. Yet for the first time in years, her mind wasn't entirely under control. Doubt gnawed at her edges like slow fire, and the name Darius Cole hovered in her thoughts as persistently as the rain against the glass walls. She had spent the night cross-checking what he had told her. The shredded documents he claimed to have pieced together did exist. Her own audit logs confirmed unusual disposal patterns from one of the research labs. The medical references, the budgets tucked under obscure appendices. There were enough irregularities to make even her suspicious mind stir uneasily. She wanted to dismiss it all, to bury it under protocol and the company's immense machinery, but the bomb planted under her own car told her plainly, someone wanted her silenced. And if Cole was right, that someone might not be an outsider, but sitting inside the very boardroom she commanded. By mid-morning, she had summoned him again. Darius entered the conference chamber flanked by 2 guards, his coveralls freshly laundered, but still marked with years of labor. He looked exhausted, shadows under his eyes, but there was a steadiness about him, a determination she couldn't overlook. Clara studied him as though he were a puzzle she hadn't yet solved. "Mr. Cole," she began, her voice carrying the same authority that silenced entire rooms. "Last night I reviewed the disposal records from the 24th floor lab. You were correct. Patterns don't align with standard procedure. I also compared the expense ledgers. Hidden budgets exist. Now tell me, how does a janitor see what my executives, my auditors, and my security failed to detect?" Darius drew in a deep breath. He hated the way she said the word janitor, as though it defined him completely, but he pushed down his pride. Because they weren't looking. People at the top assume order. They assume the machine runs clean because they built it. People like me, we see the waste. We see what gets thrown away. You want to know a company's truth? Check its trash. Clara tilted her head slightly as though reassessing him. He wasn't trying to impress her. He was simply stating a fact, and there was power in that simplicity. She turned her back on him, walking slowly to the tall windows that looked out across the rain-streaked city. "If what you're saying is true, then my company, my father's company, has been corrupted from the inside, and that means someone in my circle is not only betraying me, but willing to kill me to keep their secrets." The words landed like stones between them. Darius shifted uneasily. He had known there was something dangerous hidden in the papers, but hearing the CEO admit it aloud confirmed just how large the shadow was. "Why tell me this at all?" Clara asked suddenly, turning back to him. "Why risk your job, your freedom, maybe even your life?" Darius's jaw tightened. His mind went instantly to Amara, her fragile hands sketching castles, her brave smile as she pretended the tremors didn't frighten her. His voice, when it came, was rough but steady. "Because the research I saw wasn't just numbers. It wasn't just money. It was about the disease that's killing my daughter. If something dangerous is being done with that research, I need to know. If something hopeful is being hidden, I have to know. I can't let her die without trying everything." For the first time in years, Clara Langston felt the walls around her heart bend. She remembered sitting by her mother's bedside, watching the same tremors steal her strength, feeling powerless despite all her wealth. In Darius's voice, she heard not desperation alone, but the raw courage of a parent who had already sacrificed everything. She pressed her lips together, her decision forming in silence before she spoke it aloud. "Then we'll find out together." The guards shifted, surprised, but Clara raised a hand to silence them. "Mr. Cole, you are no longer to be treated as a suspect. You are now my witness, and perhaps my ally. But understand this, if you are lying, or if you betray me, the full weight of Langston Global will crush you." Darius nodded once, his eyes steady. "I'm not lying." and I don't betray people who give me a chance. That afternoon, Clara convened an emergency closed session with her board of directors. Darius was not in the room, but his presence was felt in every tense glance and whispered objection. Clara presented what she had discovered: the irregular budgets, the disposal patterns, the possibility of unauthorized trials. She demanded explanations. The board erupted into debate, some protesting innocence, others urging caution, a few subtly attempting to deflect blame. Sterling, the gray-haired executive who had scoffed at Darius before, was the loudest in his objections. "This is reckless, Clara," he snapped, his voice tight with indignation. "Dragging conspiracy into this room based on the words of a janitor. Do you know what that does to our credibility?" Clara's gaze cut to him, sharp as glass. "Our credibility was already compromised the moment someone tried to kill me. And unless you have an alternative explanation, Sterling, I suggest you sit down." The room fell silent. Clara had never sounded more dangerous. Meanwhile, in the holding office, Darius paced restlessly. He hated being cut off from the outside world, from Amara. His phone had been confiscated, and every hour apart from her felt like another weight pressing down on his chest. He imagined her at school, struggling to hold her pencil, pretending to her classmates that everything was normal. He whispered a promise to himself that he would make it back to her, that he would not let this building become the end of his story. That night, Clara returned to him, her face pale with fatigue, but her eyes burning with determination. "You were right," she said simply. "Something is rotten here, and I will burn it out, no matter how deep it goes, but I cannot do it alone." Darius frowned. "What do you need from me?" "Your eyes," she said. "Your instincts. You see what others overlook. I'll give you access to files, reports, spaces you've never walked. You tell me what's wrong. In return, I'll protect you and your daughter as best I can." Darius hesitated. He had never trusted people like Clara Langston, people of wealth and power who looked down on men like him. But something in her tone told him she was not offering charity. She was offering a pact, forged not from pity, but from necessity. "Then we're in this together," he said quietly. And so the unlikely alliance was born. A billionaire CEO and a janitor single father, bound by danger, by truth, and by the fragile hope that somewhere within the corruption lay answers that could save more than just a company. For Clara, it was about reclaiming her empire from betrayal. For Darius, it was about saving his daughter's life. And for both of them, it was the beginning of a war they could no longer avoid. The breakthrough had come, not in technology, not in finance, but in trust, and it would change everything. Redemption and transformation. The alliance between Clara Langston and Darius Cole was not forged in warmth, but in necessity, like two travelers who found themselves on the same crumbling bridge, knowing that to survive they had to move together. In the days that followed, the tower that had once been Clara's symbol of power became a labyrinth of secrets. Darius, escorted now not as a prisoner, but as a silent partner, walked corridors he had only ever cleaned, now with access to files, research notes, and storage rooms that executives thought invisible. What struck him most was how much truth could hide in plain sight, and how easily people looked away when their paychecks depended on silence. With Clara's permission, he dug deeper into the disposal bins, the archived servers, the forgotten sub-basements. He noticed patterns in budgets, timelines that didn't align, and equipment deliveries that bypassed official logs. His mind, once trained for engineering, awakened like a muscle long unused but not forgotten. Late into the nights, he pieced together data on a borrowed tablet, while Clara reviewed the results in her penthouse office, her once unshakable confidence slowly reshaping into something sharper and more human. Then the breakthrough came. Hidden among trial reports, Darius uncovered evidence of unauthorized experiments conducted under the Langston Global name. Patients with neurosynaptic decay syndrome, Amara's illness, had been used as subjects without proper consent. Promises of experimental treatment had lured desperate families, only for the trials to collapse into disaster, leaving patients worse than before. The files bore signatures not from outside saboteurs, but from senior executives within the company. Sterling's name appeared again and again, tied to concealed funds and falsified reports. When Clara read the documents, her face turned ashen. She had inherited her father's empire, believing it to be ruthless but clean, built on competition but never corruption. Now, staring at the proof, she realized rot had spread through her walls, cultivated by men who smiled at her across boardroom tables. Her empire was not merely under attack, it had been hollowed from within. Darius sat across from her, his hand clenched on the table. "This isn't just about money," he said, his voice rough. "These are lives, families like mine, parents who believed someone might save their children. You have to expose this." Clara looked at him, her eyes burning with a fury she had not felt in years. "If I bring this forward, the company will be shaken to its core, investors will flee, my board will revolt, I will lose everything my family built." Darius leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Then maybe you'll build something better, something clean. My daughter doesn't have time for you to protect your reputation. If you're the leader you claim to be, this is the moment to prove it." The silence between them stretched heavy, broken only by the hum of the city outside. Then Clara closed the tablet with a snap and rose to her feet. "Then we fight." The following week unfolded like a storm. Clara convened an emergency shareholder assembly. She stood on the stage of the grand auditorium, her image broadcast across financial networks worldwide. The audience of investors, employees, and press expected her usual calculated composure. Instead, she delivered something no one anticipated: truth. She revealed the sabotage, the hidden experiments, the corruption tied to Sterling and his allies. She did not shield herself from blame. She admitted she had failed to see the rot festering beneath her empire. But her voice did not tremble. It rang with the strength of a woman reclaiming both her company and her conscience. The room erupted in gasps, accusations, and frantic whispers. Sterling, pale and sweating, rose to protest. But before he could speak, Clara presented the evidence: signatures, transfers, concealed trial reports. His face collapsed into defeat as security escorted him and several others out of the hall. The scandal was instant. The company's stock plunging, the media exploding with headlines. But beneath the chaos, something deeper stirred. For the first time, Langston Global was being spoken of not as untouchable, but as accountable. Behind the stage, Darius watched the broadcast with quiet intensity. He had no place in the spotlight, nor did he want one. His concern was Amara, and whether this storm would lead to hope for her future. Clara found him after the conference, her face pale with exhaustion but lit with something rare: genuine gratitude. "You were right," she said simply. "Without you, I would have walked into that car, and into my own ignorance. Without you, none of this would have come to light." Darius shook his head. "I didn't do this for you, I did it for my daughter." Clara's expression softened. "And that is why it matters. Because you reminded me that leadership is not about profit or power, it's about people. I forgot that. You forced me to remember." The weeks that followed were brutal. Lawsuits surged, investigations spread, and the company staggered under the weight of its own sins. Yet through it all, Clara stood firm, removing corrupt executives, restructuring departments, and pledging transparency. She did not escape unscathed. Her wealth diminished, her image scarred. But she emerged with something far rarer than reputation: integrity. For Darius, life did not transform into a fairy tale, but it shifted in ways that mattered most. Clara established a medical foundation dedicated to rare diseases, its first priority the neurosynaptic decay syndrome that plagued Amara. She ensured funding for treatment, for research, and for support programs to help families like his. More personally, she gave Darius a position far beyond janitorial work, not as charity, but as recognition of his insight. He became part of a new oversight team, tasked with ensuring transparency, his voice valued in rooms he had once only cleaned. One spring evening, months after the storm had passed, Clara attended an art exhibition at a small community center. The walls were lined with children's drawings, each filled with bright colors and impossible castles. One sketch caught her eye, a castle with a wide gate, drawn in bold strokes, with the words, "For Daddy," written beneath it. Amara stood proudly beside her easel, her hands steadier now with the help of new treatments, her smile radiant. Clara turned and found Darius watching from across the room, his expression a mixture of pride and humility. Their eyes met, and for a moment no words were needed. They both knew how far they had come, from a desperate shout outside a sedan to this quiet moment of hope. As Clara walked closer, she said softly, "Your daughter has talent. One day she may change the world in her own way." Darius smiled faintly. "She already has. She gave me the courage to shout." The two of them stood together before the drawing, a CEO and a janitor, once divided by worlds, now bound by truth. The story that had begun with a desperate warning ended not in scandal, but in transformation. For Clara Langston, it was redemption. For Darius Cole, it was survival and dignity. And for little Amara, it was the promise of a future that once seemed impossible. The moral lingered long after the story ended. True worth is not measured by titles or wealth, but by courage, integrity, and the love that compels us to act when silence is easier. Sometimes it takes the voice of only one overlooked to save the one everyone else believes untouchable. And sometimes a janitor's shout can change the fate of an empire.